Hi everyone, my name is Magistrate. I'm the Program Director of HumanitiesDC. I'd like to thank you all for coming out today for our latest installment of our commemoration of the 225th anniversary of DC history. I'd like to start out by recognizing a few people. First, I'd like to thank our hosts, Busboys and Poets. I'd like to thank Alicia Bird, Ganesha Kalota, Patrick Bonesteel, and AJ Head for their patience and help in putting this together. I'd also like to thank Stephen Cole, our videographer in the back. I'd also like to thank members of the staff who are here in attendance, starting with our Executive Director, Joy Ford Austin, which I just saw a minute ago. Okay, I'll recognize, in fact, Joy Ford Austin is our Director. Joy, if you could raise your hand.
Thank you.
Okay. I'd also like to recognize Stephanie Scott, our Administrator, right here in the yellow. And Lewis Hicks, our Director of Grants, who may say a few words about our grant program. And then finally, I'd like to thank Kenia, our intern, who's in the back, who did all the PowerPoint presentations. We also have a few members of our board. If you want to raise your hands, any progress? I'd also like to thank our honorary committee, which consists of the mayor, the DC Council, DC Public Library Director Richard Reyes Avilan, DC Archivist Rebecca Katz, Historical Society Director John Swell, Cultural Tourism DC Director Stephen Shulman, DC Preservation League Director Rebecca Miller, and DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities Director Harvey Espinosa Jr. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Busboys and Poets, also DC Brown, and A Creative DC. HumanitiesDC is an independent, non-profit affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the federal agency in charge of supporting the humanities throughout the United States. HumanitiesDC is an essential part of the district's effort to provide quality humanities-related programs that preserve Washington's cultural legacy and promote civic engagement in every neighborhood in D.C. This year marks the 225th anniversary of the founding of the District of Columbia. As part of the celebration of this event, starting in January and continuing monthly for the rest of the year, we're holding panel discussions with scholars and contemporary commentators to discuss the highlights of a series of 20-year periods in the history of the district, and to link the events of the past with present-day issues and concerns of district residents. HumanitiesDC hopes to illuminate the often overlooked local history of the nation's capital and to define aspects of a unique contemporary culture of the district. Given the cultural and economic changes taking place in the city, we believe that reflecting on what our history has to teach us about the present is both timely and important. Today's topic is the modern DC woman. The historical time period that we are covering this month is the years from 1911 to 1931. In that era, the National Women's Party and its allies successfully persuaded Congress and the country to ratify a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote. This pivotal moment in American history is also a unique part of DC history, since the efforts unfolded on our streets. In 1913 in particular, a women's suffrage parade took place on Pennsylvania Avenue, ushering in a time period when women would be seen and heard publicly embracing their rights. Here today to help us consider the topic is a panel of distinguished experts. Pamela Perkins is a professor of speech at the UDC Community College. She will moderate the discussion. Rhiannon Nadeau is a DC Council member representing Ward 1. Kenia Sewane-Lopez is a DC Magistrate Judge presiding in Family Court. Nikki Peele is an entrepreneur and small business owner. She curates the Congress Items on the Rise blog. So before we proceed with the actual event, I'd like to take a minute, if Lewis is here, to talk a little bit about our grants program.
Thanks, Jay, and welcome to everyone. And it's my pleasure to also talk about our grant program. We're right in the middle of a series of grants, our third cycle, which is Choose a Washingtonian. This particular grant cycle allows people to do a preliminary application, which is due July 22nd of this year. We have a 2-week period in which I will confer with you about your grant application, and then by September 2nd you're able to make your submission. This brings together two communities that are separated either geographically or culturally from one another. We have 3 series of cycles that go through the year. Starting in January, we have our major and our small and our Soul of the City grant program, which our particular Soul of the City program, which is a Pulitzer Prize that Jay is operating at the Richard White Public Charter School. Starts and it teaches leadership skills to a minimum of 20 students. Each Soul of the City grant receives $10,000. Our other grant programs, the small grants, receive up to $1,200 and and then our major grants receive $5,000. Our DC Community Heritage Project, which is a 6-month program, begins mid-June, and it's a 6-month program in which you receive $2,500 to create a project related to a story about Washington, D.C. We end that with a showcase in December when all the grantees come together to show what they've done. And we also make a film of that particular grant program so that we capture it. Our products are deposited on our website through the DC Digital Museum. So if you have any questions, please see me afterwards. And I also like to make a plug for one of the initiatives that we're working to develop a cultural plan for DC. The city has developed gone through an initiative in which they're going to develop a cultural plan for the city of Washington. We are going to help by convening community meetings in which we're asking our community participants to engage in the process so that you infuse your ideas, so that we have heritage preservation as well as culture and humanities infused into the cultural plan. So please participate. We have meetings every 4th Thursday of the month at different locations through the city. Go to our website and you'll get more information. If you have questions, please see me afterwards. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. Well, as you can see, we're ready to have a discussion, right? Let's raise our glasses to all the ladies in the house. And our male supporters. Thank you for being here this evening, all of you that we birthed. We're going to have a very, I guess I need to take a sip of this, right? Okay, that's my limit. My name is Pamela Perkins. Some people know me as P.S. Perkins. I am, in addition to being a faculty member at the University of the District of Columbia, I have a business called the Human Communication Institute. And what we do is we work on communication effectiveness in organizational climates, families, communities. And I'm very honored to be here working with the Humanities program of Humanitini tonight. I want to thank the Executive Director, Joy Ford, for having me here, Jay Stewart, and the rest of the group. Thank you so much. I'm excited about this. How about you ladies? I know we're a little frightened here, and hopefully we'll be cooling down. I probably won't cool down that much, but I'm just really excited about our discussion. Where have we been? And where are we going? And we have some very wonderful panel members this evening. And so let me get started by letting you know who's on the panel. First of all, we have a different kind of setup. So what we're going to do is, because of the screen, we're going to present our opening remarks here from the floor, and the different panel members will stand up and address. And then when we move to the forum, we're actually going to go up on the stage after they give their opening remarks. So is everybody ready? Everybody ordered? Everybody drinking? Everybody happy? Order something? Okay. Let me just make a transition here and get started. I'd like to first start by introducing Jennifer Krafchik. Please stand up so we can see you. Jennifer Krafchik is the Deputy Director and Director of Strategic Initiatives of the Historic party at the newly designated Belmont Hall Women's Equality National Monument on Capitol Hill. It's about formerly the Sewell-Belmont House and Museum. She's been with the museum more than 15 years. She served as library director at the Historical Society of Washington, D.C. And after leaving there, she created the Ann Lewis Women's Suffrage Digital Collection. I actually looked up Ann Lewis, sister of Ron Frank. Yes, very interesting. For a private collector of women's equality artifacts. I'm expected to be invited over. Yeah, I got some stuff too. Okay. She has extensive experience in working with women's history collections, including building strategic partnerships, developing outreach initiatives, particularly around public access to women's history collections. She's a member of the advisory committee for the AASLH Women's History Affinity Group, and is currently leading 2 initiatives that will foster broader access to women's rights collections and increase collaboration between sites in the years leading up to 2020, centennial of the 19th Amendment of the Constitution, which did what, ladies? Guaranteed our right to vote. And so that she's our first speaker, but I'm going to introduce all of them. Thank you. And so now we will have, please, Council Member ReSpin on stage. And they're actually standing here beside me just to do this in case I say something wrong. Okay. She was elected to the Council of the District of Columbia on November 4th, 2014. As council member, ReSpin has worked to address public safety, expand affordable housing, hold government agencies accountable, and support Ward 1 workers, families, and schools. The first bill that ReSpin introduced in 2015 would strengthen the Board of Ethics and Government Accountability to ensure district elected officials remain accountable to residents and to make district government more open and transparent. To improve public safety, she works to ensure the Metropolitan Police Department and DC agencies have the resources they need to keep our communities safe, and to better connect residents with MPD through public safety walks and community meetings. ReSpin is working to ensure the district remains a great place to raise a family. She co-introduced paid family leave legislation, thank you very much, which would be, yes, right? Children, but anyway. Right, yeah. Which would provide paid leave for workers in the district who confront a major life event like childbirth, adoption, or caring for a sick family member. She also introduced legislation to prevent families facing extreme hardships from losing assistance through the THEARC program. She has worked to hold DCPS accountable for modernizations in the past 2 budget cycles, secured much-needed investments for Marie Reed Elementary, Bancroft Elementary, Bruce Monroe at Parkview, and Banneker High School. Let me just begin by saying, currently, she serves on the Committee on Business, Consumer, and Regulatory Affairs, the Committee on Health and Human Services, and the Committee on Housing and Community Development. ReSpin earned her MA in Public Policy from American University, where she concentrated on Women's Studies, Women in Politics Institute, and a BA in Political Science from Boston College. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Okay. Next is Pamela. We did not plan this. We did not Okay. So Nikki Peele is currently the Director of Marketing and Community Engagement for the THEARC, a 110,000 square foot community center in Ward 8. The THEARC provides free and low-cost arts, education, and social service programs to the east of the Anacostia River, adults and children. For nearly a decade, Nikki has provided marketing and community outreach services to small businesses and nonprofits as the principal and founder of ReSpin, Public Relations. Since 2008, Ms. Peele has covered Ward 7 and Ward 8 community issues on her blog, Congress Heights on the Rise. That's Congress Heights on the Rise, allwordstogether.com. Okay? In 2014, Ms. Peele was included in Washington City's paper annual People issue, in which she was featured on the cover. I remember that page. Yeah. That same year, she was named one of Urban Pool's 20 People Making DC. In 2015, Ms. Peele was awarded the Eastern River Innovator Award by the DC Office of the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development. She resides currently in Ward 8 with her mischievous dog, Teddy. And he is awful. Thank you. Join me in welcoming the Honorable Kenia Sewell-Belmont, Magistrate Judge, Superior Court of the District of Columbia. Maybe some of you have joined me to her, but that's okay. We don't need to know. What happens here stays here. She has served on the DC Superior Court since July 30th, 2012, and she currently serves in the Family Court. Being sworn in as a judge, Seoane-Lopez serves as bilingual attorney negotiator in the domestic violence unit of the court. Prior to joining the Superior Court, as she was an assistant attorney general in legal services, section of child support division in the office of the DC attorney. Judge Lopez served as a law clerk with the Massachusetts Superior Court and the DC Superior Court. In 2002, she graduated from the University of Wisconsin Law School. In 2002, she received her Master's of Arts from the University of Wisconsin Graduate School in Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies. Go home, girl. I'm telling you, because I'm like, can we get these numbers wrong? And then she graduated cum laude from Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, with a Bachelor in Science, Bachelor of Science in Justice. She has served as the president of the Hispanic Bar Association of the District of Columbia. She's also a board member of the Spanish Education Development Center in Washington, D.C. and the Hispanic Bar Association of D.C. Ms. Lopez originates from We will start first with a little bit of her story. Notice we are starting with her story. You didn't miss that, did you? I didn't get that up. We're going to start with her story, and we'll then go with all the members. After everyone gives their own opening remarks, I said before we move to the stage.
Good evening. Good evening. Good to be here. Go ahead. I'm not speaking to the slides, they're just going to run behind me because I just like images and it'll make what I say a lot more fun. For instance, suffrage cat. Seriously. So I've been given 5 minutes to run through a lot of history. I'm going to do it as quickly as I possibly can and just hit on some high points, and hopefully some of this or some of what I say will spark some questions later. I worked at the Belmont Hall Women's Equality National Monument, which, if you haven't been there, tells the story of the National Women's Party, which was originally founded as the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in 1913. It was founded by a woman named Alice Paul and a few other women, among them also a woman named Lucy Burns. And these were women who got their start over in England, fighting for the right to vote over there. And Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and many other women actually went to prison and went on hunger strikes while they were over in England. And so when they returned to the United States in the early 1900s, they were frustrated by the fact that the suffrage movement, which had been ongoing since 1848, had really not made a whole lot of movement. And so instead of going with a continuous state-by-state strategy, Alice Paul and others introduced the idea of, or reintroduced the idea of working toward a federal suffrage amendment. So when they started here in the United States in 1912, the idea was they would work for the federal suffrage amendment under an organization called the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And the National American Woman Suffrage Association, having so much faith in Paul's abilities, gave her a $10 budget and said, go for it, we'll see what you can do. So Alice Paul was actually a brilliant strategist and brilliant fundraiser. So what did she do? She staged a parade on Pennsylvania Avenue. On March 3rd, 1913. Does anybody know what's significant about that day? The day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. She staged it on the day when she knew there would be as many people as possible in town. So walking from the Capitol to the White House, they would make a pretty big impact and have a pretty big crowd. Over 5,000 women marched during that parade. And it was disrupted midway through by hostile crowds, by people throwing things and trying to block their path. The District of Columbia police were not very supportive, didn't give any support to the women, and the Fort Myer Cavalry had to be called in. And ultimately, more than 100 people were sent to the hospital, and the DC Superintendent of Police was fired. He lost his job. But guess what this did? It put it in the papers. It put the federal suffrage amendment in the papers for the first time in a long time. And that was Alice Paul's strategy. So she took, from 1913 to 1920, she did as much as she could to keep suffrage in the papers for as long as she could. The Nationalist Party engaged in a sustained, nonviolent protest against President Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party because they were the party in power. They held them responsible for the rights of women. And by 1917, they started picketing the White House. They were the first group ever to picket the White House. And around this time, the United States also entered World War I. So while the pickets started at the White House and they would hold beautiful banners saying, Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? By the end of it, by the time the United States entered World War I, their activities were seen as pretty unpatriotic. And so in June of 1917, arrests started. Guess what they were arrested for? Obstructing traffic. So, between 1917 and 1919, thousands of women marched in front of the White House, hundreds were arrested, and more than 168 were imprisoned in Occoquan Workhouse or in the DC prison. And while they were there, they were protesting the fact that they weren't being treated civilly, and so they went on hunger strikes and they were force fed. All of this worked. Kept suffrage in the papers, kept it going, put enough pressure on Woodrow Wilson that in 1919 he asked Congress to pass suffrage as a war measure, and in 1919 Congress passed it. It was sent to the state for ratification, and in 1920 we had the 19th Amendment. The Nationalist Party went on to work for the Equal Rights Amendment. They fought for political, social, and economic equality for women. And they spent the next 40 years working for things like women on juries and equal pay and women's right to keep their citizenship when they married somebody from another country. So there's a lot to dig into where the Nationalist Party is concerned, and I'm excited to be back with you.
Thank you for that great history. And once again, I'm Maria, the General Board at One Council member, and I'm so happy to be here. So I want to thank Joy and Jay and everybody else for including me tonight. There are thankfully lots of women council members to choose from. We have 6 out of the 13 right now women, and unfortunately we're losing 2. So I'm looking at all of you ladies. You got to get ready to run because we need more women on the council after this. But I'm honored to be here. I do find it hard to avoid HumanitiesDC events because my wonderful Chief of Staff, Tanya Jackson, is on the board of directors. And although we keep our extracurriculars out of the office, somehow we are always having great conversations about what you all are doing. So thank you for including me. And I also just want to commend you on the name of this series. I have toyed with creating a drink for politicians called the Humanitini, but this is perfect. So I've been thinking about this a lot since I was first invited to speak. I've been reading this book called All the Single Ladies. I mean, I don't know if you guys have read this one, but it's actually, I accidentally read the novel first, which is also cute. But the book I was trying to read is nonfiction, and it's a really good refresher on our women's history. For me, it was actually really personal, and I'm not finished with it yet, but it's been really personal to read it. Because in addition to sharing all of the struggles that we've gone through as women, and of course, highlighting something that I think is really important, which is even as the women's movement, which I think is supposed to be better than all the other movements, we haven't always had equality in our own movement, right? So when we did the march, black women were separate, women of color were separate, right? And that's part of our history too. So it's a really good refresher on that, but it also reminds me that I've had this privilege to live in DC for the past 14 years as a single woman. And as I'm about to get married this fall, thanks, but I'm a little afraid because I'm now realizing about how special it's been to have that independence. And as much as I love my fiance, and I tell him this all the time, I'm a little afraid of what it means to have this man in my life that I'm going to now have to help take care of. So I've been thinking about it a lot, and I know it is. I'm being funny, but it's true. It's as women, we take on more responsibility in the home, in relationships. It's what we've always done. And so as a council member, I think a lot about that. It's not hard to feel it in my own life. I see it in my friends, I see it in my community members, and that's why I'm working on things like paid family leave. Because if men and women both have paid family leave, then we can share responsibilities in the home. That's why I'm working on expanding access to early childhood education and childcare, because we know mothers every day have to make that choice between staying home with their child because it's too expensive, or contributing to their family income. And so nothing is more pressing on my mind as I'm approaching that stage in my life, but it's always been something that I've been thinking about. I wanted to share with you sort of my formative Washington moment, and I set that aside from I separate Washington and the district in my mind when I think about things, but my most formative Washington moment was the March for Women's Lives in 2004. How many of you were there? The March for Women's Lives in 2004. It was a while ago, right? Okay. So we were marching for reproductive rights. And it was 12 years ago. And we are still every day marching for reproductive rights. But it was that day that I said, all right, I need to get out of this career that I'm in and I need to get into politics. And so I went to American University. I studied at the Women in Leadership Institute. I got to know the women that I love and work with closely on all my programs where I help train other young women to run for office. And each of you should think about running for office because we need you. Because when we do things on the council that impact women, we have to explain ourselves to the men. And it's not because our men aren't supportive. But I introduced legislation on street harassment. Now, you all know what street harassment is because you live it. You walk down the street, someone's talking to you about your outfit or what your butt looks like or whatever it is. Doesn't matter what you're wearing, doesn't matter who you're with. I introduced legislation to study this, to do education, to do training, because my dream is that 10 years from now, street harassment is treated just like workplace harassment. We remember, and I just finished watching Confirmation, which is this incredible film about Anita Hill. If you haven't seen it, I cried the whole time. It's all about what she went through during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. You now can't start a job without getting sexual harassment training. If somebody harasses you in the workplace, there are consequences. But right now, in our cities, if you are harassed on the street, that is just what you're supposed to expect. That is just what happens. And you might not even be a woman. You might be a person of color, or you might be a trans person in the trans community. I mean, there's all the kinds of folks who are being harassed on the street. My experiences as a woman, yours may be something different. But when I introduced this legislation, we had 40 people come out and share their stories in a roundtable. And I was up there, I've never cried on the dais before, but listening to the stories of women who've been harassed for the first time as a 12-year-old. So we're saying to these girls, make yourself small, right? Shrink on the street. Don't be yourself on the street because someone's going to harass you, and that's just the way it is. I had people call into the radio show when I was talking about this and tell me I should move back to the suburbs. Extreme harassment bothers me. And these are women. So these are the things we're dealing with in our community that I'm trying to get a handle on the council. We also have introduced CEDAW, which is the Convention to End Discrimination Against Women, that only a few cities across the country have ratified. Our country hasn't ratified, but it's time. And we're trying to move that through the Judiciary Committee. I just talked to Councilmember McDuffie about that this week because he has daughters, so he knows. You know, I just feel like I've had so many great opportunities in this job to do this work. I know I'm actually not staying all night, so I know I'm going to be given the opportunity to answer a few questions while I'm up here. But I just want to drive home the point to you all, because I see so many women in the audience, is you have to run for office. Because I get to sit in this seat and I get to offer my opinions, and I get to say to colleagues who haven't experienced what women experience, this is what it's about. And they may be allies, and men in the room, you care about this issue, but you haven't experienced the way we do. And if it's not your experience, it's hard to convey. It's the same conversation we have about getting more people of color in elected office and all of the issues that we're dealing with in our communities. And let me just say that it's been a rough few days. And when I think about the violence committed against innocent people by the law enforcement agents that we're supposed to trust, it really hurts my heart. And we can do better than that, but we have to keep electing people who are willing to make those changes. So you all have to get ready.
We're going to break protocol for a minute. Unfortunately, Councilwoman is going to have to leave in a few minutes. So we want to field a few questions because we don't want to deprive you of her learning experience. And I think she said we need some women to step up in politics. You know, a lot of this litigation affects us, our families, and our community. That which is going on everywhere. And I have a very heavy heart today after waking up this morning to, huffing to the post. And when I open up my phone and I'm like, again, this morning? And I'm trying not to start my day that way every single day. But that's the way it's turning out. And so I have to switch gears and get ready to go out and fight the good fight, right? So we're going to field a couple of questions. Jay is going to come around. Does anyone have questions for our councilwoman? Anybody have a question? Again, she's talking about work-life balance. She's talking about what it means to get involved and still have a life and be a woman doing it, like Miss USA that we now have from the District of Columbia, right? We saw her yesterday being crowned here again yesterday. We have a question.
Well, while we wait, it's on. Well, you make an impression of John, or John is into my speaking. You made the actual
I'll repeat the question. I can hear you.
And you can talk about how one would begin to make those steps.
Yes, the question was, how does one begin on the journey to run for office? Well, mine started at age 11, so I won't take you back that far. I knocked on doors for my friend's dad when he was running for office, and I was totally hooked. And I, like, to this day, my staff, I make them crazy, because even though I'm not a candidate, I make them come out with me to knock doors to talk to people, because it's so awesome. I mean, either you love it or you hate it, I guess. So I talk to young women all the time about running for office, and I always tell them the first thing you need to do is get to know your community, right? So in DC, that means joining the Yahoo group. Can you believe we still use Yahoo groups? But we do, and they work. It means getting to know your civic association and attending those meetings. It means getting to know your advisory neighborhood commissioner and attending those meetings. And getting to know who the people are that have opinions and who has shared opinions with you, where the leadership backings are. When I first decided to run, it was for ANC. But I didn't just decide to run because there was a beloved ANC in my seat. And so you don't just go guns a-blazing and say, I'm going to take down the person in my path, because that doesn't earn you support from the community. What I did was I started working on the neighborhood watch. I started working on the neighborhood cleanup. I got to know that ANC. It turned out he didn't really want to be in that job anymore, but he knew that I was working hard. And so when it came time for him to step down, I was able to step in. And you may not have that opportunity. You may see that there's someone in the seat that you want to run in that isn't a good person or isn't working hard. And that's a different type of opportunity, but it all starts with getting to know your community. And for any of you who are interested in running for office, I will meet with you and I will talk to you about what it takes. And there are organizations I will connect you with. But I find, although I'm talking quite a bit right now, the most important skill you have is listening before you open your mouth, knowing what other people are thinking and caring about, so as not to alienate yourself from the people in the room, whatever room it is.
We have another question here.
I don't know what to say or not.
Hi. So you spoke about the recommendations for women who are able to run for office or are interested in running for office. So what is your recommendation for younger women who aren't eligible to run for office, or young women who on a daily basis experience kind of harassment, abuse, or that on the streets, even at home, and that sort of thing? What would your recommendation be for them to get involved in projects like this, and to stand up for themselves and fight for a certain right and enjoy it?
So, great question. It was about how do women who are not yet old enough to run, how do they get involved, how do they engage in these things, and also how do young women deal with harassment if they're experiencing it in their communities. So, first, I work with very young women, and they may be running for student body president. But it's never too early to start, because not everybody wins the first time, and you get that great experience just by doing it. And the way I really got involved to start was by working on other people's campaigns and gaining that experience and seeing what it takes. Supporting other women candidates is a great way to go. So those are a few things, and the program that I volunteer with is called Running Start. And that in particular works with girls as early as middle school age. And in fact, they just completed their summer training for the high school girls. And I was mentoring a group, and their campaign won, and I was so proud of them. It was awesome. I mean, it was really all them, but you know, it's kind of cool that I got to help. With harassment, it really is up to each of us to decide what we feel comfortable with. I sometimes talk back. I sometimes walk away. I sometimes report it. I'm not happy to say that just a couple months ago I was on my way to a community event in my professional attire when a DC employee riding on a DC vehicle in a DC uniform harassed me, not once but repeatedly, when I asked him to stop. And I will tell you the response from the director of that agency was swift and appropriate. But it was a sad thing to have to report. And woe to the DC employee who made the mistake of doing that to the council member who introduced the bill. But contact with me while he was doing it. But the response has to be personal. Now, we talk a lot about bystanders. As a bystander, it's important to be aware of when this is happening to someone else, to reach out to that person. If you're walking down the street, you see someone being harassed, don't put yourself in danger. But simply say, hey, are you okay? It means a lot to be acknowledged when you're the subject of harassment, whatever that situation it is. It's always important to acknowledge each other's struggles, and that's key. And we've had some success already with Metro. Metro has been doing education around this. They've got a hotline now. They're training employees. I think about what it would look like if we could simply train every DC employee on what to do and what not to do. So what is harassment? What do you do when you see it? How do you not be a harasser? Because apparently we need that training in some agencies. But that's thousands and thousands of people in this city who are walking the streets every day. And from there we grow. We do things in the schools. So it has to be each person. We also have a wonderful organization we work with. It's called Collective Action for Safe Spaces, CAST. And they have some incredible programs as well. We've been doing some trainings with them. So there are things, but we gotta keep pushing on it.
We got time for maybe one more, maybe two more, maybe one. Someone else? Yeah, is the Mac right? I don't know. Yeah, it keeps going in and out. I'm not sure what the problem is. Put it way up to your mouth. There it is.
Well, it was just something, a suggestion that is along with the same goals, but not in the actual political arena. I just recently discovered meetups, and I'm actually thinking of joining a couple, co-ed ones. Anybody can create a meetup, and it's possible to form a community group. And I'm just going back in my own experience. When I belonged to a writers group, and we had smaller groups, and our group was on something like political science, but one day we decided to do a cleanup project in our neighborhood. And we did that. And it's really, to me, it's like there can only be a couple of A and C representatives, but to do stuff that,
sure. Yeah, so the point was that it was about meetups, but really I think even deeper about finding people that you can relate to and talking with them about the issues you care about, which is what politics is all about, right? It's about what we call affinity groups. And I think in my life, the version of that would be all of the organizations that I belong to, which now include things like super nerdy things like the National Conference of State Legislators and the National League of Cities and the Democratic Municipal Officials. Seriously, it's like alphabet soup. But the reason I belong to all these organizations is because I want to talk to them about statehood. So I travel now to all these conferences and meetings across the country to talk about statehood, and I'm telling you that they see me coming and they're tired of me. But that's how it should be. Whatever your issue is, you want to be that person that they associate with that issue. So that's been really important.
Don't most of these organizations have license?
The question was, do these organizations have membership fees? The ones that I'm talking about, yes. The ones that you might join in your community typically are open participation, and then it depends on each one, but a lot of times if you want to vote, you have to join and pay the membership. So mine is Meridian Hill Neighborhood Association. You guys are in my neighborhood right now, and it's a $20 a year fee, and I know if someone has trouble, they work with you, because the reason they have that fee is to support their activities, but they don't want you to be excluded, and that's a really important part of our civic engagement. Thank you so much for including me.
I'm going to give you a moment to think about this question, because we have all of these women issues in our society that have reached great proportions in terms of governmental impact, from living better, fair pay, from family work life, family leave, all of these things, what would you consider to be one of the most important? Because they're all important. What do you think is one of the most pressing women issues that we need to really politically stand up for right now? Take a moment to think. And while she's thinking about it, this lady that asked about, I just want to put a plug out there. For many years as a woman of color with limited means, there were lots of organizations, not to say that both go hand in hand, but there were many organizations that I could not get involved in because I couldn't pay entrance fees, I couldn't pay membership fees. And I think that this is something for those of you that have organizations that can support us as a collective, no matter our color, our class, our position, we really need to create opportunities for women that do not have means to be able to get involved with your groups and your organizations. Because it's one thing to talk, but it's another thing to really open the door and bring people to sit at the table with you. And this is a problem that I've seen my entire activist life. So I think it's just something, it's a really important question. So are you ready to get us to it?
As ready as I'll ever be. Okay. So it's very hard to choose, and that's why I took this job, right? I think the game changer for women really will be universal child care. And I say that for a number of reasons. It's multifaceted. One is it allows women very definitively to be in the workforce, right? Which means they're not falling behind on their pay, which we know is still an issue. It means that they bring something to the table in their family relationship, whatever that is in terms of their earnings. So, sometimes that can create more equality in that relationship. But it also means that their children are getting that early start that they need and setting them up for success. And what I have learned as a council member and really just as a human is that when we put all these resources into K through 12, which is very important, we're already too late. And I'm looking at the babies right now, and that's what I'm working on. We've got pre-K 3 and 4, and I'm working on the babies. We're coming back with babies. So.
Thank you so much, Councilwoman, for being with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Tanya, for being with us. We're going to keep going. We have 2 more 5-minute, and seriously, 5-minute presentations. We gave her a little bit longer for obvious reasons. She has so much to offer, as they all do. We're going to go now to Ms. Nikki Peele. Yep, you're next.
Hello, everyone. How are you today? Okay, I know we already did a toast, but I feel like we need to do another one. I already drank my Humanitini because I'm a single woman and we have to be no, we run out anymore. So, because you don't know what may happen out of that. So, can we give a toast first? We're not only here talking about history, but we are actually making history. So, we all should be acknowledged for that. For all the women in here that are doing it and doing it big in their own way, and to the men who love and fear us. On a few things, so we'll get 5 minutes. I'm going to ask my dear friend Beth to wake me off at 5 minutes because I like to talk. Because I have a lot to say. Oh, that's what I'm talking about. I do a lot of things. Oh, by the way, this was the whole of my other rock star. So I'm going to do like a rock star. I'm like Jay-Z, I'm late. I do a lot of things. I'm a blogger, a lot of people know me as that. If you're tweeting, I'm the advocate. That's what my handle is. It's some lovely woman with like a mask and red lipstick. I don't know where I got that from, you know what I'm saying? But I thought it was kind of fabulous. And I also work for an organization called THEARC, and I do marketing and community engagement, and I'm also a community advocate, and I also have a small business called ReSpin PR. I came up with that name because I said, redirect your revolution, and that's, I think, was the key to every evolution is a revolution. So I do a lot of different types of things. So before I talk about that, I want to give you a little tiny story about my first job, which is really my first business. And I think most people, when you talk about their first job, it's like, oh, I had like a paper route or a babysit. I had a bank. I started a bank. I like to say I was 6 years old, but I might have been 7. But I started a bank in my bedroom. The kids in the neighborhood had their allowances. I had construction paper and glitter, so I would make checks. And the kids would bring me their allowances in cash, and I would get them checks. Glitter checks. And this went on for like 2 or 3 months, and the kids trading checks in the neighborhood. And I'm sitting up in my room with like little kids and atomic balls, the whole like. But one day somebody told my mother, and she shut down my head. I learned 2 things out of that. One, with glitter, you can do anything. Write that down because I was saying that. And the second thing was just be fearless. Be fearless. And I think that when we're born, especially for young girls or young women, we are fearless. We don't know society's norms. We don't, before we find out about you gotta be a lady, you gotta be quiet, you gotta be safe, you gotta get along, get home. We are fearless. We are on the monkey bars, we put your Jenny in the sandbox, we taking that hot dog, we are doing it. We're wearing a tutu in the middle of the day because we can, because we're fearless. And somewhere along the line, we grow up in society, and sometimes it's our parents who love us because they're trying to keep us safe, but sometimes in the name of safety, they are killing our inner hustle. Okay? They don't mean to do it, but they're killing our inner hustle because they're just trying to teach us what they were taught. So somewhere along the line between pre-K or before you started your bank, and the time you go off to college, you were busy trying to be a lady. Ladies are quiet, they're praying in little white gloves, you know what I'm saying? And they're boring as hell. I don't meet any ladies, they're boring. They don't even have good lipstick. I want to be a woman. Correction, I want to be a badass woman. Raise your hand if you're a badass woman in this room. Thank you. Now raise your hand if you're a man and you're a badass woman too. I see you. So I say this stuff to say, when I started my, I went to Howard University, HU, master's student loan debt 2 minutes. I went to college and I wanted to do what my parents thought I should do. I really wanted to be a fashion designer, but I was like, ain't nobody gonna pay me to do that. So I was like, let me go and I'll be a doctor. And have a relationship. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. I was like, I don't want to do that either. I was like, just get a degree in biology. I'll figure something out with it. Never did anything with that degree. But I got a job in the legal staffing industry, came in as a receptionist, the only lady in the office and the only black person in the company. And I did that and worked my way up. And from there, I still didn't know who I was. I was too busy trying to be a lady. Many years went by, I graduated like 21, 22 when this happened, and the really quick change came for me, and I did the job, made a ton of money for a long time, worked my way up to being like the director of legal ops for the country. It sounds more important than it was. I'm sure I just made people cry on the regular, this is kind of what I did. And then I moved to Southeast to a neighborhood called Congress. And you never say, what, Congress Heights? It's just not Anacostia, so stop telling me about that. Anacostia is a neighborhood that is not everything east of the river, right? And from there, I saw the neighborhood was nice, just had a bad rap, but they had a market plan. You know what I'm saying? I was like, remember I told myself, I got a minute. I want to talk about a lot of different things, but I'm basically saying, for those of you in this room, that's all of us, we are all struggling with something. Stop listening to that outside voice, because your friend might be your friend, but they might be killing your hustle. Listen to your inside voice. Our inside voice will always tell us the right thing to do. Despite the fear, keep it pushing. Keep it pushing. Feel the fear and keep it pushing. Because the magic happens where you're not going to be comfortable. If you fail, then fail on your own terms. But just don't be a lady. Be a badass woman.
It's being recorded, and I have to record my answers, but I'm very careful what I say. But I want to thank Jay for the invitation and for seeking me out for this position, for this panel. When he told me about it, I said, this is exactly the kind of thing I used to go to when I had a wife. Before children. interesting, and I think that this discussion is worth having. I've already learned a lot from my co-panelists, and I need to get some glitter for my bench, because I need to make some things happen, like people get jobs. So I'll let you in on a secret. I wasn't around in 1911 to 1931. Okay? By many standards, I'm still young. Not by my standards, I feel really old these days. But I am a young mother, working mother. I have 2 kids. I have a 7-year-old boy and a 2.5-year-old crazy girl. And I struggle with many of the things that we're talking about here today. Affordable care, child care. It's crazy. It's quickly. It's almost like another student loan debt that I pay. Student loan debt. And I just talked to some of the interns in my office today, and I said, you know, there's a way to limit the debt, but we're really fortunate to live in a country that you can borrow money to come out of the class you're in. And I have a lot of friends who struggle with student loan debt, and I said, think about what your paycheck would look like if you hadn't made that investment. And then come talk to me. So pay your student loan, pay it on time, so that other people can benefit from that money too, and can actually succeed in life and get an education. And any other country, that would not be possible. If I was in Cuba, I would be stuck in my own little world. And so I paid every month, and I'm glad to pay it. Child care, not so glad to pay it. So I am glad that I live in DC and I have pre-K3 available, because I am going to avail myself to that next year as soon as I can. And I'm grateful for the councilwoman and everybody who's really worked to make DC kind of stand apart from Maryland and Virginia. And I always say to families, why would you leave the district? We have pre-K3, we have pre-K4. In Maryland and Virginia, you don't have those options. And if you stay here, you can make the city really great, and your children can start school earlier. And so I'm really grateful for the work that people have done in that. And that really, I'm proud that DC is leading in early education. And I welcome the work of the babies, even though I'm done. I'm not going to benefit from that. But I will be happy, and I was extremely happy when they passed the bill with the 8 weeks of paid maternity. My first maternity leave, I had 4 months of unpaid leave. I paid my maternity leave with a credit card. I finished paying it not so long ago. For my second maternity leave, I borrowed a year of vacation in advance. So when I came back, I was a year in the hole. I didn't have a day off for like a year and a half, seemed like a lifetime. But I paid back, and I'm not going to swing, and I'm ready to take my first vacation, so I'm happy about that. So we go back to the first slide. They asked us to look for slides, and I spent some time thinking about this. I kept finding this letter. I Googled work-life balance, and this is what I got. Family work. Not so much. If you do this, you'll be boring. You'll be one of those boring women, right? It has to be a lot more than that. And this is an unattainable goal, right? Because if you just do work and family, you're not going to be an interesting person to your family or to your work. Nobody's going to like you at home or at work. And so I think that the next slide is actually, if you're going to have a goal of balance, which I'm going to argue later, it's not really a goal to have, because balance just doesn't work. But if you're going to have one, this is more like it. You know, you have other circles. You have family, you have career, you have friends, and you have your health. And all those things kind of interchange. And the best way that I've seen it explained is, I have a judge who's a really good friend of mine. He's a mentor to many people. And during his retirement celebration, he said, you know, people keep telling me why I'm going to retire. And I tell them that, you know, I see life as a stove, and you have different pots on. And many times the different pots were my work and my outside activities, and it's time that I shut those burners off and concentrate on my family. And I said, well, that's a pretty great analogy to think about. That, you know, at any time when we're cooking, there's some things that are high heat, there's some things that are low heat, there's some things you can shut off and put in the back until everything comes together. And I guess as a retirement, I don't know, I'll never see that, but I have 2 kids to get through college and a lot of student loan debt, so I'm going to be working till I can't work no more. So I think the next slide is really, you know, probably a very true statement. Like, there is no such thing as balance when everything worth fighting for balances your life. So I think that as a modern DC woman, which I consider myself to be one, I've been in DC since 2004, getting close to that point where I've lived in DC longer than anywhere else, and so I'm getting closer to calling it my home, but really you have to live with a balance. And you also have to deal with the stress, which is the next slide, which is what people expect you to do. People in your family, and like you said earlier, they may mean well, but they expect you to keep all these things going. And that's not really reasonable. And so they want you to do it all. They want you to lean in, and you want to lean back. You know, and some days you just want to wake up and stay in bed and hide from everybody. And, you know, some of us are afraid to say that. And, you know, I have friends who have babies, and I told them, like, breastfeeding sucks. And one of them said, I'm sorry, that was my experience, I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. One of them said, you know, you're the one who's ever told me the truth, because in those deep, long nights, I thought about what you said. Because it made me seem like it's all great, and, you know, you're wounding, and it's painful. And you do it because you save money on formula. And yes, some women get some benefit out of it, but, you know, I think that, you know, we put a lot of emphasis on what people say, especially when you have a child, and people tend to give you advice unsolicited. So that's not really a reality, and I think if you try to do this, you'll be really tired. And again, nobody would want to be spending time with you because you'd be stressed out. So the real reality is the next slide, and I came upon this and I thought this was great, because this is the reality. One of those days, this is pick any two, right? Guess what? One of those two things I can't pick. It's called working full time. That is a constant. I don't have a choice at this point. At some point I might, who knows, if I win the Mega Millions, which I'm going to play right after this. But, you know, and working full time, it's, you know, what stays here. And then in any given week, I can do any of those things. I'm not going to tell you which one. Let's just say that fit, trim, and well-groomed, not one of the priorities I choose often. I mean, well, once in a while, maybe. But, you know, never will I have my laundry done and my house clean at the same time. And that's okay, because nobody's in the deathbed saying, I wish I had a clean home. And my husband was saying, we need a cleaning lady. And I said, not to let you have my son watch it. There's nobody cleaning this house. So he's in it for 30 years. And then I'll leave you with this last quote, which is one of my favorites, which I think is really highlights the importance of how you do it. Like, you can do it all, you can't do it all at the same time. There are different times for everything. And we have to support each other in those times that we choose to do it and not do it, and not judge when someone decides to stay home and take care of the baby, because that's what they feel that they need to do. And we need to be supportive of each other. So I'll leave you with that, and just really quick, at the last slide, it says, do something today that your future self will thank you for. And these are the things that I got about. Don't settle. Wait for that perfect mate, whoever they may be. They'll think you need to settle because there's someone around the path for you. I waited a long city for a long time. I had to import my husband from Miami. There's not that many Cubans here. But guess what? I waited, and I am so grateful for that, because he is an amazing guy who's right now feeding our 2 kids, very supportive. I could have settled years ago. I would have been miserable, probably going through a divorce at some point. Save for retirement. Be financially independent, so that when you need to walk out, you can. Be okay to sit and dine with yourself. If you can't do it, who else can, right? Create a drama-free life. And that's what I tell you from my work. There are people who have lived in drama all their lives, and they don't know that they can cut the drama off. That's right. You can cut people off of Facebook, you can change your number. Life is dramatic enough, you don't need to add to it. Someone brings drama to your life, you got to tell them to leave. Because you can create your own space where you're drama-free, and your drama comes from places where you can control it, like I work from 9 to 5, and you go home. And the other thing is, live like a student when you are one, so when you're a professional, you can live like a professional. That means that you use the student loan money wisely, and that you are not out there drinking and partying with the money that you're going to be paying for the next 30 years, that you're cooking your own meals at home, that you're not eating out. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much.
Well, are you ready for the next half? Maybe not quite half. We have probably about 30 minutes where we're going to build questions. Ladies, take your seats and get ready. Start thinking. What is it that is on your mind? How can we as a collective group, while we're here together, inspire each other, support each other, encourage each other, and glean from the wisdom that is there? So we have the mic. I'm not sure if the mic is working, right?
Can you guys hear me? You have to speak into it like this.
In your mouth, like this. Love it. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go up and join them, I think. Who has a question? And please direct your question to the particular panelist, or you can say, this is to whomever would like to answer. Are you ready, ladies? Okay. Who'd like to go first? Come on, we're going to start talking. Let's talk, ladies. You know we can do that now.
Don't be scared.
Don't be scared. Anybody have a question for one of the panel members? Yes. Okay.
It's cool. I got a big voice. Nikki, you said the thing about Congress Heights.
Yes.
I'm wondering how you achieved the PR-ness of Congress Heights. Could that work? But you know what I'm saying.
No, how I did it was I saw that there was a need, and what I did first is that I wish I could sit up here and say, oh, I did a case study in my library. You know, I started my business and my blog. I got to fight with no one. I'm being serious. She's older than me, and she's okay. And everyone knows the story. And you know, and I want to be involved and engaged in my community. And I was like, hey, I live here, I own this house, this condo, I want to get engaged. And she was like, who are you? What gives you the right to say something? Why would you even want to be involved? And you know, we kept talking, and she was really mean, and I kept looking around because I thought it was like, what's that show with me? I'm like, oh, she must be joking. You know? And then I tried, but I was like, I don't need this. I have a condo and I got a gate. But I went out and said, I paid a mortgage. I live here. I'm somebody. You know? And I said, you know, let me come up here and make sure that no one else feels like this. And so I started my blog. That's how I started with a blog. I didn't know what a blog was. I had to Google it. By the way, we have a web blog, if you were wondering. And I started my business because I saw that there was a need, and I kept saw no one was filling it. And I always feel like people are waiting for someone else to fill a need that you see because you want validation and you should do a job. You know what that's called? Second place, and nobody thinks for that. So I said, let me start this blog. I had a voice, and then I started writing stories about my experience, and then press people kept reaching out to me because everybody at the time was lazy. Nobody lived in the river. So they were like, let me just Google somebody and talk about this stuff. And it was me. And so I said, you know what, this is actually a business that I should get paid to do, but more importantly, it affects my community, so I just did it. I just stepped out there and was fearless. But let me tell you, there were times I would go to places and people would come to me. They would walk up to me and be like, are you Nikki Peele? I don't know that girl. Who's that? So I see everybody here has an idea for a business or some kind of concept. We do a business now. First of all, women are always doing this. We're doing hair, we're doing eyelashes, we're doing something. Get paid for it, and then you have to. That's what I said. Just do it. Just do it.
Yes. Judge, she's up here in the front, but.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your experiences with us. I think you're based on this question. I would like to ask this question, if I may. It says that drawing on the legacy of activism and political involvement, women in DC today have access to the city's top jobs. But does this apparent success belie persistent inequalities? So that's my question to you. Considering your position How does that connect with you?
Well, because we get paid statutorily, there is no unequal pay, so that's good for my job. And we are very fortunate in DC to have a very diverse bench. That wasn't the case when I practiced in Massachusetts. There were maybe a few Latinos in Massachusetts in the whole state that were judges. And so I think in my job, the inequality that I see is the people who are here before me, but not necessarily me experiencing it. So I perhaps should not be the person talking about it. But, you know, there's also inequality in the hierarchy of the system because judges get paid to do committee work and, you know, I have to go home at a certain time. If I had all the time in the world, I could probably do more committees, but I don't. And, you know, we do have meetings, monthly meetings, suddenly they're running. Makes it hard as a single mother for some of us who work with me or single moms to be able to get their kids off to school at that time and still make it to the meeting. And those are just things that are institutionalized and people don't think about. The Marshal Service, the protectors, I talked to them about, what about, you know, judges who have kids, how do we protect them? And they had no clue because they never really had judges that had really small children, and there is a critical mass of us who do and worry about their safety every day. And so you kind of hold the system accountable to be able to evolve with the needs that you are bringing to the table. But at the same time, you got to be careful how you bring those issues to the table as well.
Certainly in my position, we talk about the history of the suffrage movement and the equal rights movement, but I would say that is not an inclusive history. There are a lot of inequalities that we address in the legacy of women's rights. When the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, African American women didn't really enjoy that right. Native American women, there were lots of people who weren't granted. Do I need to do this? No? Do this? Like a rock star? And then also, I mean, I think we have a lot of women who come through every day, and so we talk to them about any number of sort of persistent inequalities that they deal with. You know, women running for office, there are not enough women in office, so I'll kind of echo what others have said. Equal pay and child care. I have a 6-year-old. I definitely know all about that. So there are so many. We just have to constantly fight and fight and fight. And the minute that you get lazy or the minute you think that it's all done, that's when you start to lose those rights that you fought so much for. And so it's just a constant, I mean, at least that's something that we talk a lot about, is just constantly remind yourself of the rights that people fought for before you and the rights that you still have to fight for today. So it's sort of, in terms of your legacy, just a little bit of that.
I think that's a great question that you asked. And we may have all these government jobs here in the district, we have federal, we have DC, but I'm just constantly reminded that no matter how much I feel like I've achieved now, I still remind myself I applied for several government jobs and never got one. You know what I'm saying? And I was more than qualified to do the work, but I don't think the work was qualified for me. In terms of, you know what I'm saying? I think particularly when we deal with government things that may be it may not be as progressive as we are right now. It might be down the road. In terms of equality, I think we've made progress, but I have to say for me as a small business owner or someone who works in the nonprofit industry or as a community advocate, it's not even remotely equal. I may be in the room sometimes, but that's because I had to knock down the door, elbow somebody, BCC someone else. It's a constant hustle. Everybody knows about the BCC plan in here, it comes in coded language. So I don't want to say men all the time. I won't say unenlightened men. Sometimes it's women, but I notice it comes in coded language. I hear, you're too much. You know what I'm saying? You ever hear that? Oh, she's smart, but she does too much. Translation, she's mega, and I don't want to deal with that. Yes. Or, I had a professional person tell me, who is a male, I ain't gonna say who it is, what I noticed about women when they get executive positions, then they try to be like a man. And said that to me with not a hint stories like this. And this is why I say it's not even so much what we hear, it's what we don't hear. It's the meetings that we're not in. It's the memo that we did not get. You know, it's the feeling, I think of all the women, I think we all had a moment in this room where we were like, we wanted to get involved, but maybe we had to wait for permission. Do not wait for permission, take it. Yes. That's all you gotta do is just take it.
Have a hand over here. That one right where you are, Jay. So why don't we take the, and then we'll come back to you, Miss in the green. Remember, easy.
So when we do run into situations like our federal government, oh, there you go. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, so I'm federal government, and I run into a lot of situations where like, I do cybersecurity. And I worked really hard to be accomplished in that field. But I find that those situations you talk about are there. I don't know how to address it. I don't know where is my avenue to say, I'm here and ready, willing, and able. How do women push their way forward in a field where you know that you're capable, you're able, you are being pushed out of meetings, you aren't included in things that you know you belong to. You're probably smarter than a lot of the guys sitting around there. Where is the avenue to address those things? Does laws have to change?
I think one of the issues that we need to start to look at is to have more of a collective mentality that we bring and a more, when I say feminine attributes into the workplace. I think that oftentimes we do adopt aggressive versus assertive, certain dynamics in terms of how we're dealing in the environment. It really is just adding to that which is the problem. And instead of creating community, bringing the best of who we are in terms of our own attributes and our abilities, and saying, collectively we can get this done. And that collective mindset is colorblind, it's class-blind, it's based in ability of people to come together and work closely. I think a lot of it is the culture that we live in, and we have to look at the culture and see, what are the underlying ways in which we tell people they have to get ahead. What do you have to do? How do you have to do it? And whose game do you need to be playing? And I don't think a lot of that's going to change until we decide that we are tired of a culture that is, everybody winner take all. It's my way or the highway. It's me, it's I. That's not who we are generally as a people, and I think that's one of the problems.
I think I would add to that we shouldn't get discouraged. Things in government change really slowly. And in order, you have to do your homework, right? In order for you to make change, you have to really understand the system. So take your time to understand who got there, who put them there, who their mentor is, kind of do a roadmap about how the people get to where the decisions are being made. And it may take that you do a lot of work and not get credit for it and be okay with that. But just keep on trucking. You got to keep doing the good work. And don't let that get in the way where you just become complacent. It's like, well, I'm not going to move anywhere, so I'm not going to work as hard. You continue to work as hard to leave every day. You're proud of what you're doing and what you're producing. Eventually, people will take notice. But in order to change the system, and every office has politics, you have to really understand them. And you have to really set out and be aware of that. And just ask questions. And it might, like she said, it might be just a relationship. Like you see people at work, have lunch with them. Ask them, hey, you want to go to lunch? That's actually going to be my New Year's resolution next year, to have lunch with my colleagues, because we are so busy, we don't make time. And I don't know a lot about them, because we're all doing our own calendars. And my goal by the end of the year is to have lunch with the 24 judges I share in chambers with. And that's a lofty goal, because I never go to lunch. So I'm going to make that a point. But a lot of the things, if you notice, a lot of the decision making, a lot of the bonding is done outside of the office, or it's done when people connect on other things that are not related to work. So you want to look at that angle. You want to look at,
you know, what do they do on the weekend, how many kids they have, and really be genuinely interested in people as a whole. And you'll see that those walls will start coming down, and they will start including you, especially when they realize you're the one who's producing the work. And, you know, it may take a while, it may take years, but I don't think that you should let your work be compromised because of that. And in government, it takes a long time. But you know what? You have till retirement, so you have a good retirement plan, so yeah.
I'm going to preface what I'm about to say by saying I've never worked for the government. So I've always worked in the private sector or was a business owner or worked for a nonprofit. So what my advice may be totally different here. I think that as women, we need to be strategic. And I think a lot of times we get, and I'm not saying this is your situation, but I think we passively sabotage ourselves by trying to hold this mantle of being ladylike or wait our turn. And that waiting can take too long. We all have a shelf life. And I can't say that hard enough. Like I tell women today, please don't waste your time on a loser dude. You will never look as good as you do right now. Maximize it. And you may have to diversify. If you are kicking tail and taking names in your industry, if you know that you are and you're not getting the respect or the moving or the opportunities in your career, work the system, be strategic, and sometimes you have to have a mentor, and that mentor may have to be a man, because they're about deliverables. If you know, if they know you deliver, they could care less if you're a man or woman, if you deliver in a clutch. But I've had to say, I've noticed this in meetings, and even for women who didn't realize they were doing it, somebody would say something, usually they'll be a higher up, they would say something, make a suggestion, the room would be deathly quiet. And I'm looking at this woman, I'm like, I know you had an idea because you told me in the hall. And you'll be quiet because you'll be waiting for your turn. Sometimes you just got to say it and say it with authority. And to be honest, if that job is not giving you what you need, diversify, move on. We will stay in a relationship past the shelf life. Women, if we said, come on now, this ain't gonna work for me, look for something else. You may have to start at a lower step at your new gig, but if you have the opportunity to move up, take it. Let's stop being afraid. Let's stop minimizing ourselves.
I want to encourage the young ladies in the room. We have a lot of youth here. So take advantage of the panel. Take advantage of the potential mentors out here. Do that because, you know, it's about you. It really is. So do we have any young ladies that wanted to make a comment or ask a question? I don't want to put you on the spot, but, you know, we're here for you. Okay. Well, you're young. Please. Very much so.
And I have been gobsmacked when I've heard young women say, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. I would like to hear from each one of you how I should respond. I hear a young woman say to me, I'm voting for Donald Trump. Please give me your response.
Well, a string of excellence would be the same, but what to say if somebody's going to vote for Donald Trump, particularly young ones? Educate them on how far we've come and how easy it would be to take all of that away, and how what he says, he's not an advocate for women. He's certainly not. He's working against us in a lot of ways. And so I guess I would try to educate as much as possible about how all of the ways in which he's working against them. I don't know, I have to give that one some more thought. All I can think of is, you know, what are you thinking? Are you out of your mind?
And also, obviously, she has somewhere, something in her psyche, her socioeconomic world, her business life, whatever, says that this is the man that's going to preserve what I have. And I think a lot of this is the appeal of Trump. He's going to preserve what I have. And so you might need to ask her, what is it that she has that she feels that he would be able to preserve for her, and that would be the foundation of the talk. Why would you want to vote for him? Why would you encourage me to vote for him? What is it that you think he is bringing to the table that will advance my cause as a woman, as a mother, as a grandmother, as a community member? You know, sell me. And I'm pretty sure she's not going to be able to do that very well, but at least you can understand, because I understand where people are coming from. A lot of people are, you know, I need this way of life preserved. Well, exactly what is that? And can we do it collectively without excluding entire groups of people and demeaning entire groups of people? So I'm hoping we're not running into a lot of those, but they're out there, obviously. But there's a reason for them to be there. And it's about our democracy. And that's a good thing. But we have to stand up and say, wait a minute. Let's ask some questions. And let's be honest. Okay, so I think that's one of the issues. Would you like to say something? Okay, let's go.
I'm not really sure on that one. First of all, I know badass women, so nobody I know is going to even say that anymore. But someone did pop up in my spot and say that one of the things about Trump, and he said, Lord knows, he said, straight up, really ignorant things. But the one thing that stuck to me was when he stood up, and I think he was covering for some other horrible thing he said. He was like, you know, Donald Trump is a protector of women. That was the most obnoxious thing I ever heard. And so I guess I would say to this person, they said it to me, are you a damsel who needs protection, or are you a dragon slayer? Because if you're a damsel, please go get in the tower and do something else, because this is not for you.
Okay, we have, good, hands have been raised. Yes, sir. Someone has a microphone. Okay. Jay?
So my question is, I work in museum education and working in a nonprofit with a community focus. A lot of the work that we do doesn't necessarily fit a schedule that's very convenient for a woman. I suggest her shaking her head up there because she knows. But so my question is, what are some strategies for enacting the time? And I know, working in community engagement and being involved in politics, especially local politics, towards an evening. What are some strategies that you have, the panel has, on how they've managed to make the balance work in their own lives?
Well, I'll start. So I have a 6-year-old daughter. Just as a side note, she's named after Eleanor Roosevelt and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So, and that was my husband's idea. So anyway, 6-year-old, and yeah, I work a lot of late nights and a lot of weekends, and there's a lot of expectation of sort of being available. Before I came over here today, the air conditioning in the museum stopped working, so after I leave here tonight, I gotta run back over there and check it out, make sure the collection's okay. So I do understand. The first piece of advice that I always give is don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. So I take full advantage of my networks of people, and we all have them. So our parents are very involved. We have a very involved family. We also have friends that we're not afraid to go to. So we always ask for help when we need some help making that balance work. I'm fortunate that I work at a very supportive place for women, and so I've been very fortunate as far as maternity leave goes and some of those other things that a lot of women don't get, but I know that's not the case everywhere. And I think, if you can find a supportive person within your workplace, kind of using them and finding that mentor or that person who can kind of help you strategize about that, I think is very important, because they can help you figure out what's going to work for you. Every situation is different, so there's not one size fits all. So really advocate for yourself, advocate for your needs, and set your limits.
The list of people that can pick up my children always exceeds the available space. They only have 3 lines, and I have like 6. And I have their numbers, and we actually became really good friends with my son's pre-K teacher, 2 of them, and they both have kids the same age. So when I'm running late, actually one of them is picking him up from summer camp, taking him home, and then we pick him up from there, because we have to get to the other one by 6 o'clock. Sometimes we split up. I go one way, my husband goes the other. He knows ahead of time about this event. He's known for the last month. I remind him every day. Don't forget, on the 7th, I'm going to be late. And you know, you have godparents for a reason. You make godparents of people who are going to be in DC. They're not going to be any help if they're somewhere else. And you just use the network. It does really take a village. I mean, my mom, God bless her soul, she came twice with both of our kids. She just left. She took care of our daughter and our son for 2 years. She put her life on hold and came to live with us in DC. And that was amazing. So she was gone, and we got home, dinner was on the table. We're now struggling. I just signed up for Blue Apron. I'm like, let me try this. But, you know, you just work your resources, and you know, sometimes you got to fly in grandma. The court has a drop-in daycare that I use sometimes. Last week my son was in there 3 days because we had a break. And you just make it work. Sometimes he comes to court and he just sits there while I'm in court, but you know, he's old enough not to do that. And he's going to spend a lot of time in my office, and you just make it work. I think you gotta, if you're a single parent, you gotta surround yourself with the community. We have this other parent where, like, if they can't get to it by 6 o'clock, they're texting us by 5:30 to pick up their son, and we pick them up, and then we meet up somewhere, or they come to our house. But we do have a very good community, and the teachers were amazing. His teacher comes to pick him up every morning, his pre-K teacher. When I need to get to 7:30 meeting, she picks him up, and my husband takes the other one to daycare. So you just have to make sure you ask for help. You can't do it alone.
More questions? Yes, ma'am. Here's one.
I still formulate my question.
Okay.
Put it really close.
Oh, okay. All right. I just want to say that I'm incredibly honored to be in the presence of these beautiful women here today. And I was just, my question is, like, what advice can you give to a young woman who's still trying to figure herself out, who's still trying to figure out her purpose and what she wants to contribute to the community? And just basically just making herself a better woman and things like that.
I think that's a great question, because by the way, you're stunningly beautiful. And I was like, I have a question. She's stunningly beautiful. You know, I sit up here now, and I'm 39, and I think when I started this journey, I was 29, a little and then to 30. And the funny thing is, you look at me now, and I think I exude this appearance of confidence and humor and laughter. I used to be a torment. Like, I remember when I was like in my 20s and my mid-20s, I was trying to please everybody. I was the pleaser. And I would be resentful. You know, and I had issues with that. And then I finally realized, you know what? I had to unlearn what I knew before. And then I had to look for new mentors. And I would say the biggest thing I think for women, in my opinion, is that we question ourselves on everything. Like, something I've noticed is that men will tend to overestimate their qualifications. We will underestimate them. You know, and we have to stop that. You got to take. So I think my mom gave me the best advice when I was at your age. When I was in my 20s, and I would have my first major corporate job. And I was like, honey, what do I do here? Like, what do I do? She was like, Nikki, I do not know. She was like, I have never had this experience. She was like, so the best I can tell you is go find somebody who did, and then just do it. I think the first time, people talk about the power of yes, harness the power of no. That if I can tell you anything, no. Because you will spend so much time making other people happy, making your parents happy, you know, trying to compete with other women, that you will forget yourself. So do that thing you're terrified about doing. Step out there and do it. Because if you mess up, you still won't be a boss, because you got fabulous hair. You cool.
And I say find really good mentors, and it's okay if you don't know what you want to do. I think if you talk to all the adults in your life, everybody's in a job that they never imagined. Like, I never imagined that I would be a judge, and it wasn't until I worked for a judge, and he said, you know, I think that you should apply to be a magistrate judge. You should think about that. And I said, really? Little me? Like, why would you say that? And he was like, of course. And I remember his look. And then he passed away. And I had in the back of my mind, I didn't think that I was capable of that work. But when he passed away, I said, you know, I'm going to apply for the next vacancy that comes available, just because in his memory. And I got it the first time I applied, so maybe he knew what he was talking about. But you know, you got to find mentors who believe in you and start seeing you in the light that you want to see yourself. But also you shouldn't be afraid to tell people where you want to be. Like if you want to be an astronaut, you should just tell people, I want to be an astronaut. They'll start seeing you in that light, and if they get an email about an astronaut workshop, they're going to send it your way. And that's how you get into some of the things. So don't be afraid to say what you're thinking, what you want to be, and seek out people who are going to help you get there. And just do cold calling. Hey, I think I want to do this kind of work. You think you can have coffee with me? You would be surprised how many people would actually say yes. I would say you get more yes than no's. And if you don't hear back, you call, we get 500 emails a day. You say, hey, I know you're really busy. How about I come to you? Or, I'm really open. My schedule's available. When can I meet with you? And if they can't help you, ask them, do you know somebody who can? And they'll send you to somebody else. But you're going to have to keep working, and you're a work in progress. I think there are people who are 50 and 60 who still don't want to do what they do with themselves. I think you always need to contribute back to come to the community and to make sure you mentor women in high school. That's empowering enough so that you get your own self-worth. There's always someone, like my mother would say, there's always someone worse off than you. And so you can't compare yourself to the worst, you got to compare yourself to the best. Because if you compare yourself to the worst, then you'll never get anywhere. And so just seek out people who are going to help you in your journey, and don't be afraid to say, I don't know what I want to do. And just explore different options.
Yeah. That's different from what they're going to say. The only thing I would just say, the only person who's truly going to advocate for you is you. So advocate for yourself every day, explore what you want to do, and it's going to change. I'm 39, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. So we're all constantly evolving, and you just have to keep exploring your interests as you form them. So.
I read 2 books when I was your age. Oh, I read one book when I was your age, and I read one recently when I was in Jamaica. I'm glad. The first one 10 years ago was called, it was a short book, but it was really good. It was by Kelly Patron, and it was called If You Have to Cry, Go Outside. And I think it was amazing about building your own tribe, as well as if you go to people and ask to be mentored, ask them to mentor you, but also that you should be giving them something too. It should be even exchange. I would highly recommend that book. And then the one I just read was Girl Boss by the girl who does Nasty Gal, the website. I remember we both started our eBay companies at the same time, and I eventually ended mine. Now she got her $100,000.
And don't be afraid to look up for mentors who are men. I have a friend, my biggest mentor, she's always says the best mentors I've had in my life have been men and white men.
Yes.
So don't box your mentors to be this separate box.
I think one of the things that we're hearing as a common theme here is get to know you first. The world is pulling us this way, that way, this way. Know thyself first, and take the time to be okay with that, and don't feel that you have to enter the rat race immediately because the world says I have to. No, you're on your own time, and you need to take time to know you first, and build your passion, and then go out and share it with other people. I found that was a problem with me early in life. Okay, we have any other questions? Oh, a couple more. Yes, sir. And I think we have maybe about 5-10 more minutes. All night? No. Okay, about 2 minutes.
Hi, general question for everyone on the panel. Speaking as a young man who, like this young lady over here, has very little knowledge of what I like to do in the future, but with so many voices in my ear. Granted, I bring some of those on, I read certain things, and I have a certain thing. But oftentimes when I'm speaking with friends, men or women, one thing to bring up, or one thing to reference is pop culture. Because we all grow up in era, just my generation from us, where pop icons have become such a loud, and at least in our eyes, an important voice. And maybe some people in the audience know what I'm talking about, but I'm referencing Beyonce. I love her. I adore her. But what the panelists have just said has struck a chord with me. How much of her and people like her should I and other young men be listening to? And how much should we spend listening to ourselves and the other mentors? And how much of a balance should we strike? And how much you really just have to say, we focus on these actions. We focus on what this person's saying. How do we, or how do you suggest we go about balancing those things?
I'll start. I think it's about, I think it's about educating yourself. So, but I'm thinking back to this morning, I actually said something to my boss. I said, there's too much noise in my head. I'm hearing, I can't listen to the news in the morning anymore. I don't even listen to music or podcasts because there's just too much noise going on up here. And I feel like I'm not having an original thought. And I said that this morning because I think there's always so much noise around us, and we're just, we're constantly looking at our phones and listening to what's, we're constantly inundated with pop culture, news, everything. So I think it's all about educating yourself and reading as much as you can in a diverse array of pieces, and then kind of taking a step back from that and kind of figuring out where you land within all of that noise. Does that make sense?
First of all, you always ask who your audience and who's your source for any information you're getting, right? That's question number one. Beyonce's an entertainer, yet you should be listening to her music. But really, I don't know that she's an authority on anything else. Maybe I don't know Beyonce enough, but I know that she doesn't struggle with daycare expenses. And sometimes you got to look at people's perception of what their reality is. And she's an entertainer, and that she should be an entertainer. Now, there are some entertainers who have crossed over and have become something else, but I don't think Beyonce's at that stage. So she should probably not have that much influence in how you think politically and about the community and how you perceive the world. But she has great music, and she was okay until she went to Cuba. I'm kidding. But she deserves a place in your world, but probably not the place you're giving it. And if you always ask, who's the source? Where's the source coming from? Because you're going to hear all kinds of crazy things. And you always got to look where it's coming from, and then that will put it in different boxes. But she's from the entertainment world, and she should stay there until she does something about the community. I don't know that she's done a lot of things for $1 million. That she may have a foundation, okay, but maybe she knows about that thing. But I don't know that she would be the holy grail of how you perceive yourself and your self-worth and your political ideals. It can't come from one person. So.
Well, I slay, and I appreciate Beyonce for that. So I see her, and we use that as an example. I don't just see her as an entertainer, so I'm not finding her. I think she's a businesswoman. I think she does a lot of things, but more so that I find her quite fascinating is the unapologeticness of her badassness. Right, and that made no sense. But she was just unapologetic. She just wanted badass. And I think that was cool. And I think no matter who you have in your life that you aspire to be, it doesn't have to be like, I'm an okay dancer. Lord knows I don't have a butt or abs, but I'm cool. But I think everyone should try to be the Beyonce in their life. You know what I'm saying? Or whatever it is that you want to do. And so if I can give anybody any advice, and I say this as a 39-year-old who has my own issues, who's like, I'm not entirely sure I have clean pajamas tonight or in the refrigerator, I will say this. Go in a love affair with yourself. I don't even know if you have whether you have a relationship, if you in one or not, have a love affair with yourself. When I was this age, I was trying to figure out my stuff, I realized I didn't value myself. So how can I sell myself if I didn't value myself? So I would send myself flowers and buy myself toys and gifts and things like that, and I still do. Rightly on the regular. On Valentine's Day, I sent myself flowers and chocolates. And I found those for me. Because you have to love yourself. The best compliment I ever got was somebody on my job recently was a gentleman, and I'm single now, I don't have any kids. He said, Nikki, I was talking about, I just was coming back from Martinique for the second time, and he was like, I'm going 2 more times, and he was like, Nikki, you treat yourself very well. And I said, absolutely. And you should do that. Because you cannot sell yourself if you don't believe in yourself. And sometimes you have to also, I think, put yourself in a zone out, and you have to find that zone that works for you. Because when I'm doing a project, I'm focused, I get in the zone in my mind. And when I get in my mind, I can connect the dots easier because I believe in myself. I'm at the point now where I believe in myself. But that's going to come with time. And you're going to do a lot of different things. If you think, whatever you think you're going to do today, you're going to do for the rest of your life, you're probably not going to do for the rest of your life. So you're going to do a couple of different things. I've been an event planner, a personal shopper, I sold mannequins, you name it, I'm just about done. And I might have been a hitman. So I figure it out. You'll be fine.
I'm reminded of Judy Garland. How many of us remember Judy Garland, right? And this famous quote that she said, why would I be a second-rate version of someone else when I can be a first-rate version of myself? And that is what we are all here to do, to know ourselves and to pull in those voices. But a lot of them are discordant. A lot of them are not talking to you. They're talking at you. You have to decide which ones are listening to that perfect you, that pitch in you. You find that perfect pitch and you go with it, you know? So I always admire her for that, because I think all of us have to kind of get through that. You know, I admire that, I was going to be Diana Ross for a long time until I figured out I was not. And I was still stuck with me, you know, so I know I'm aging myself, but that's all right, you know. Okay, who do we, yes. Oh, okay, come, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So we talked a little bit about the history and how it wasn't always inclusive, and I'm so lucky as a young woman in 2016 to be living in maybe the most inclusive place this fight, this movement has been. But how can we make sure that this fight and movement is inclusive for transgender women, bisexual women, and lesbian women? And how is a very tough question. It needs its own panel in and of itself, but yeah, how can we make sure this fight movement includes those women?
For me, actual engagement, and I always talk all the time, is that you have to, if you're going to be truly inclusive, you're going to go outside your comfort zone. And that means you can't call your friends or your friend or your friend. You have to go out your comfort zone. You also have to be really comfortable being ignorant, because I think there's a lot of things that people are uncomfortable with, or they don't need to be more inclusive, because they don't know where to start. Like, they don't know what to say, they don't know who to call, and I think the first thing you got to say is, hey, I am ignorant. I know that there's probably a whole lot of people at this table that I have not even thought should be at this table. Go somewhere where, don't be afraid to ask someone, or there's amazing organizations, particularly in the District of Columbia. But I would say, even with those issues, I run into people sometimes who think they're inclusive, but they're inclusive up to a point. Like, they're inclusive as far as Northwest, but they ain't gonna be inclusive to Southeast. Yeah. But they consider themselves mad liberal. You know, but they're not gonna go there in a coffee at night. Yeah. So I think you have to challenge your own borders and be willing to say, I'm a little ignorant and I'm willing to become less ignorant.
We have time for one more question. Anyone having a burning desire to not leave tonight and not have their voice heard? This is about our voices being heard, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Anybody else? Or else we can call it a night, and I can get another martini. Okay, one more.
Hi, my name is Dana Belson. I'm a recent college grad. I start my first corporate job on Monday. I thought it would be really interesting to stop by and get advice. So I think my biggest question is about balance. So I initially had this great idea about work-life balance, right? I had it all planned out. I was going to work 9 to 5, weekends, I was traveling. When I came from work, I was going to work out. I was going to maybe work on a blog or amazing things. But like you said, of course, everything was right the way to be balanced. So my biggest question is, if you can go back to when you first started out, how are you able to fully commit to your job, fully be excellent, fully be really, really good at what you do, but you still stay true to yourself? I don't want to become like a or to become boring in a sense. So how do I find that balance where, even if it's not really my values, I'm not just the financial advisor?
I think that you have friends outside of your little world at work. Those friends tend to bring you in and keep you grounded. But also you may have days that are 9 to 5 and you may have days that are 9 to 10. And that's just the way it works. So I wouldn't give up on the 9 to 5 and go to the gym. Maybe, every day might be something you can't do, but you can do it once in a while. And so pick that date and plan around it. but still allow yourself the liberty to leave at least one day on time, and do what you need to do. But I think you know, we tend to gravitate to people more going to the same, and law school is a perfect place for this because everybody was stressed out, and that's why I did a master's degree. I'm like, I gotta get out of this law school, these people are crazy. And so, if you had your eyeballs up here, I was not talking to you, because during exams, I don't need you to stress me out. People sat there after class and they took an exam. Like, you take a 4-hour exam and you have to sit there for another 4 hours discussing when you wrote, when you didn't write. I had this rule. Don't talk to me about the exam. I took it. I can't change anything. I'll be at the bar if you want to talk. You know. So like I say, you gotta surround yourself and make rules, like, and keep friends that are not in your corporate world, who keep you grounded and you talk to them often, and make it a point to call your best friend, you know, once every 2 weeks or something like that, and that brings you back to the reason why you're there, and sometimes you can forget that.
I would also add to that, I mean, I think as you're going into this first big position, be smart and be strategic, learn as much as you can, get a hold of as much information as you can, because the more you know, the more you'll be able to, that an ad from like the 80s, the more you know. But just kind of constantly taking information about the company that you're working for and be strategic in your job, because you'll have more control, and that will give you more control, hopefully, over your personal life and the things that come after work. So, you know, I always try to keep as much control over my calendar as I possibly can. And so I'm very strategic about the way I schedule meetings, so that I'm, you know, and not everybody can do that. And I would imagine that in the world that you're going into, it's probably very different than the world that I work in. But I think being strategic and being smart and knowing yourself, knowing what your values are, and what's really important to you in your personal life, and what you're not willing to give up, and what you are. So some things will have to give because you're going to be busy. But know those things that you know your limits and know what's valuable to you. What do you hold valuable?
I'm probably going to tell you something totally different. But I love that though. I think I aspire to that in this current life. I'm reminded of something my father told me when I was in middle school, probably elementary school. And I'm saying this to you as a beautiful black woman wearing a Spelman shirt going into her first job. My father made me go through life. You want to work twice as hard to get half as hard. So you're going to have to decide, in addition to all of that, we have an additional layer of stuff that we have to address. So for me, you're going to decide what's important to you. And it might not be going up the corporate ladder. It might be having a life. That's totally okay. I am in this. You know, but if you are trying to get in the game, you might have to decide, do you want a work-life balance now, or do you want to crush it right now so that way you may have some other opportunities going down the road? Because one thing I've noticed for me, and maybe it might have changed in the private sector, we don't always get included in social things as many or more our other counterparts, because people do things that they're more social to do. And we may not have the connections and that other people may come in a situation with. So I'm telling you is this, and I tell this to any millennial, and I've had millennials work for me, you think you leaving here at 5 o'clock when we got a project tomorrow is not going to happen. But you can, but I'm hiring somebody else's hustling. So you may have to decide now what you want to do. I was crushed. I used to work in this right here, but we were like moving furniture. We were working 7 days a week and doing all type of crazy stuff. And I had different jobs, but now I've had to apply for a job in like 6 years. I get offers. I just put something out the street and say I'm available. Someone show up with a check. I'm like, what do you mean? You know, so you got to decide what's going to be your hustle.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, wow, great, yeah, excellent panel. Thank you so much. I think we are going to pull for a prize or two, and I don't think we should leave here without acknowledging, you know, we're on the precipice of probably electing the first female president of the United States. And if so, it's time for us as women to step up and step into that which we were born to do, all of us. And these ladies don't have a magic bullet, a magic pill. None of us do. We have to get into the trenches and be true to ourselves and do what we need to do. I have a number to call out. Everybody have their little red ticket? You probably didn't even know what this is for. But I think they want it, and I don't have glasses, so we're going to let somebody else read that. 1-888-2506. Come on, it's out there. Let's say it again. 1-888-2506. Is that your number, ma'am? No, she don't wrap it up. All right, let's put it. Who has it? No one? Let's put another one. Okay, Austin. 1-888-2519. Oh, that's you. 2519. As she's receiving her prize, we invite you to visit the website, HumanitiesDC website, to see where we will be convening again next month under the direction of Mr. J. Stewart and his comrades. Joy Board, please join us again. Thank you so much. Raising my back